Nehru, at that point of time, with the limited resources that we had, he laid the foundations for which we actually have celebrated the laurels in the coming days. For example,
And how would you respond to this criticism that he awarded himself Bharat Ratna?
Giving political asylum to Dalai Lama, mistake or the right thing to do in 1959?
1962 was definitely a blunder. Not listening to the advice coming from the strategic establishment.
Even if the intentions were pure.
Intention.
But as they say, the path to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
Though the AICC wanted Patel to be the Prime Minister or at least the leader who goes into the interim government, they presume that he will become the Prime Minister. Gandhi said that I need the charisma of Nehru.
So Nehru was not entirely wrong when he took the Kashmir issue to the UN. And also don't forget, it made pragmatic sense. We couldn't have dragged the war in Kashmir.
he is also regarded as one of the people who promoted dynastic politics by the various different other countries to give us grains. It would make national headlines that wheat has reached Indian ports and now we will have enough grains.
In a book, Himalayan Blunder, which is written by Brigadier John P. Dalvi, he clearly states that we did not have even rifles.
Yes.
The right ammunition was not given to us. We were simply dropped to defend a border where on the other side, all of the ammunitions were available.
But later it was Nehru who worked with Homi Bhabha, with Vikram Sarabhai,
I understand.
and initiated the nuclear and space program.
You have created a system where very few people have got majority of the benefit and they belong to a particular political party.
The secrets related to goes under the carpet and there was a lot of, you can say, sanitization of the image.
And yes, there might have been mistakes, there might have been some flaws, but should we character assassinate a leader of such a large nation?
Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this discussion on the legacy of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, independent India's first Prime Minister. Nehru was a visionary leader who played a pivotal role in establishing the democratic credentials of India. And his influence is felt across the political, economic, and social landscape of our country. However, like all great leaders, his legacy is both celebrated and contested. On one hand, he is revered for his contribution in establishing independent institutions in India, advocating for scientific temper, and laying down the foundations of a socialist and secular India. On the other hand, however, people are criticizing him for his economic and foreign policies as well as for his idealism. Today on this program, we have two groups, one in favor of Pandit Nehru's legacy and the other having critical perspectives on his leadership. Our goal is not to create a division, but to engage in a thoughtful debate to understand the nuanced legacy of independent India's longest serving Prime Minister. Let me start this debate with Chetan sir. What are your initial thoughts on the legacy of Pandit Nehru?
When you try to dissect the character of any historical figure, that to someone who was as revered as Nehru, it's always a dicey game. It's very important to separate the facts from the fiction. Because much of today's perception of Nehru, which has been built, it's largely based on fake news, misinformation, and a perception that Nehru was a weak, naive, idealistic leader. I strongly disagree with this. Nehru was someone who was driven not only by his progressive vision, which was evident even in pre-independent India, but after becoming the Prime Minister, he was dealing with multiple challenges on different fronts, be it the external conflicts, the challenges in the global order, given that the Cold War divide had created very difficult problems for India, plus the internal economic situation, the social problems. So considering how Nehru performed over those 17 years as the Prime Minister, I think he did a phenomenal job of leading an independent country from scratch, where everything had to be built from scratch, and putting out multiple fires on multiple fronts. So today it's easy to look back in retrospect and say that he should have done this, he shouldn't have done that. But I think overall assessment shows that Nehru was a widely revered leader, considered as a global statesman. And yes, there might have been mistakes, there might have been some flaws, but should we character assassinate a leader of such a large nation just based on certain faults or certain mistakes which might have happened? At the end of the day, he was human as any one of us.
Hello, learners. On behalf of Unacademy, I wish all of you a very happy and prosperous New Year. May all your legitimate dreams come true. If your New Year resolution is to prepare for IAS, then our New Year resolution is to teach every single civil services aspirant. But to fulfill this New Year resolution, we understand we need to make our subscription more affordable. And that is why, for the first time ever in the history of Unacademy, we are offering a 60% discount on UPSC subscription plus CSE Assure, which means if you subscribe to Unacademy for 2 years and God forbid you are unable to crack this exam, Unacademy will extend your subscription by another year. So make the best use of this offer. Go to our website, select the subscription of your choice. You might see a different price being quoted on the website, but if you use IAS English as a code, you will unlock this 60% discount. Happy New Year once again. Let's crack it.
Unacademy. Let's crack it.
Mukesh sir, you are also defending the legacy of Pandit Nehru. How far would you agree with Chetan sir's assessment that you should not use the context of the past to make the current judgment on the legacy of a prime minister?
Right. So I would agree with his point of view in the sense that hindsight is always the biggest and the harshest teacher that we have. And today we have the luxury of hindsight. But we also have to keep in mind that Pandit Nehru actually was at the helm of affairs when India was at its very fragile state. A newly independent India, a newly created modern nation. Now, at that point of time, the life expectancy was below 30 years. Just for a brief point of time, if we think about that data pointer, an average Indian was not expected to live beyond 30 years. That was the condition of health care. That is how precarious it was. Our literacy rate was down at the bottom. We did not have any modern infrastructure to compete with the rest of the world. This was the kind of situation which India had, for good or for bad. But that was the reality. Nehru, at that point of time, with the limited resources that we had, he laid the foundations for which we actually have celebrated the laurels in the coming days. For example, setting up of scientific institutions that you have talked about, giving prominence to IASC, space research. That is one of the very great contributions of Pandit Nehru. Also, when it comes to the premier institutions for education, like the IITs. Now, today we argue that should there be more number of IITs or not. But he laid the foundation of that. Whether there was a follow-up of that or not, that is a matter for a separate thing. Again, he laid emphasis on infrastructure, building dams. He regarded them as the temples of modern India. Now those dams, the fruits of that, are still something that regions like Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, they still end up benefiting from that. Today, one of the very prominent problems that we face in our country is the problem of overpopulation, overpopulated centers and cities. It was Pandit Nehru who conceptualized the idea of setting up of new townships, new cities. He set up the region of Faridabad in the externalities of Delhi and thought about it that this can be an industrial pivot, an industrial central place, which can drive the growth not only of Delhi, but also of the surrounding areas. That is Nehruvian ideology. His economic policy, when we talk about 5-year plans, yes, we might criticize the concept of 5-year plans today. But think about it, at that point of time, India needed a long-term vision for growth. Nehru did provide that. Yes, the 5-year plans, did they materialize or not? That is a matter of discussion. But we have to understand, as per the first 5-year plan, the projected growth rate of India was somewhere around 2.5 to 2.6%. India outpaced that. India grew by around 3.6%. So the economic front, that is where he did drive the policy in a constructive manner. Yes, at that point of time, we did not have enough food to eat. We were dependent on the grants by the various different other countries to give us grains. It would make national headlines that wheat has reached Indian ports and now we will have enough grains. So proceeding or rather stewarding the country through that tumultuous time, that is something for which you have to give him credit. And he was one of the true statesmen. Nowadays we use statesmen in a very kind of a liberal manner. But at that point of time, he was one of the most respected world leaders of his era, where you had global leaders respecting him, seeking his point of view, seeking his opinion. And that is where he, in a way, piloted India to a position of prominence, despite the fact that we had economic lacunae, our socio-economic conditions were very poor, but still. And other than that, also the foundations of democracy in India. If we take a look at our neighborhood, basically Pakistan also gained independence at the same time. We saw that how democratic ideals were flouted. It was the stewardship of Pandit Nehru which cemented democracy in our country. So I would always say that, and I would agree with Chetan sir in this, that yes, there are certain lacunae that you can drive out of his policy decisions. That happens when any political leader is there at the realm of affairs for a very long period of time. But Pandit Nehru and his role in building of modern India as a true architect of modern India, that cannot be denied.
And not to deny the fact that he led the country at a time when the country was partitioned, unfortunately on religious grounds. So there was communal violence as well. And how to bind the country together despite the religious differences, that speaks volumes about his contribution to building the modern India.
Yes.
And with that, let me take this discussion forward and understand the nuances from the other side, because you're contesting the legacy of Pandit Nehru. Your thoughts, Sham sir?
So no doubt, whatever his policies have been, they have been implemented at a time period when India was facing issues. But at the same point of time, we need to understand that India was competing with many other countries which were facing similar issues. And they adopted certain policies which were rejected by government of India at this point of time. For example, you talk about agriculture sector. There were many experts who argued that we should focus on agriculture sector. We ignored it. And that is one of the reasons why we had to face the food scarcity issue in India. You talk about, let's say, laying the foundation for democratic institutions. At the same point of time, he was instrumental in dismissing democratically elected government in Kerala. So what we have to look at is, yes, there are policies which are very important. At the same point of time, we have made certain mistakes. And we have to be critical pointing out these particular mistakes.
Your take, Abhishek sir, on the legacy of Pandit Nehru. What is your disagreement with his policies?
So when you assess Nehru, and I divide his time period before 47 and after 47. As a freedom fighter, he did what was needed. He was flexible. He disagreed with Gandhi also. But the strength of Nehru was his flexibility and the way he dealt with the British itself. However, after independence, it is his idealism, and though he understood the Cold War politics quite well to go with NAM, but thereafter he had a certain idealistic proposition that maybe the world order is going to be just. So therefore, though he understood the order, but he went into a certain direction hoping that the Cold War politics is going to do justice to India. The second aspect is the First Amendment of the Indian Constitution itself, bringing in public order and creating that reasonable restriction concept, but giving the executives the power to misuse it also. Thereafter, the way he dealt with the China war is pure naivety. I would not say that he doesn't understand politics. This is the paradox of Nehru. He understood the politics quite well. He never wanted to align, but once America and Russia started to give a lot of heat to India, he got overconfident with China. And if I add to it, the way he blocked Patel's path in reintegration of multiple princely states, the problem with Junagadh, the problem with Hyderabad, the problem with Kashmir, I'll not say that going to the UN was the biggest mistake. The fact that he was delaying it, he was extremely, you can say, condescending about the Privy Purses. Whilst Patel was being pragmatic, he said we have to give concessions. He was like, they are barbarians, we will not deal with undemocratic people, we will not deal with autocrats. That is not how it happens. So therefore, whilst people will say that he is pragmatic, if Nehru was flexible, if he understood everything, then why is that after 47, he then started to become extremely conscious of his own legacy? He was extremely conscious of history. He thought, how will I be assessed? And therefore, he created a mixed bag of issues which contradicted themselves. Talking about Panchil, talking about Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, being a socialist, he already, both India and China got independence 2 years, 47, 49. Initially, we have a very good relationship with China. However, if it came to border disputes, why were we so ambiguous? Why were we trusting China so much? So this idealistic understanding that I have a certain left bias or of a left orientation, and because Mao and we have a shared experience of colonialism, we will cooperate. This is called the lack of realism, which his daughter quite a lot had. She was quite pragmatic in dealing with a lot of issues. The way he could have easily added shall in place of may in the Official Languages Act. He complicated that journey also. So therefore, in a democratic journey, before independence, no doubt he's a very important figure. Bose was on the two left. Gandhi was saying unconditional support to the British during the Second World War. That made no sense. He took the middle path. So when he was so flexible, why not after independence? Nobody can deny that he was managing a country which was burning in every sides. But that doesn't mean that you still hold on to ideals which may also make that path equally problematic.
So for you, was he ideal or naive?
Naivety would be not the right word for him. He had been a part of the Comintern. He had traveled the world. He had been to USSR. He understood world politics quite well. That is where I will credit him that NAM was the need of the time. However, the naivety or I would say the paradoxical nature is that he wanted to project a certain, he was, as he said, a towering leader. He had a certain persona. In order to build that persona, hold on to that persona, he may have gone a little bit too far. This is where sometimes what happens is we tend to argue and we tend to hold on to things for the sake of it. This is where he understood that his legacy is also becoming problematic, and that's when the later periods he started to also repent and regret what he did. So it is not that he's naive. It is that there is a certain ideological, you can say oxymoronish dilemma which he has, which he's not able to resolve.
Some strong words for independent India's first Prime Minister. Let's delve deep into each of these aspects one by one.
Before that, sir.
Yes, sir.
Vishek sir brought up two very important points. And I think it's better we counter it right away. Because this is largely part of the misconception that has been built up. Abhishek sir spoke about Nehru not being realistic with China, that he was propounding the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai theory, and he never acted tough on the border issue. But to counter you, Abhishek sir, over there, yes, Nehru did empathize with the Chinese struggle, the Maoist movement, the shared colonial experience, correct. It was critical at that point to build good relations with our neighbors, right? And yes, at that point, mainland China was not an immediate neighbor of India because Tibet had not been annexed yet. Right. So until 1949, India was, in a way, we were very welcoming of the Chinese Revolution, the Civil War. We reached out to China, recognized PRC, one of the initial countries to do that. But immediately after that, when China got aggressive, when China started showing its expansionist, aggressive behavior, it was Nehru who immediately brought up a counter against this. When Tibet was annexed in 1950, Nehru adopted the buffer strategy. You can't discount that. When you look at the Himalayan kingdoms like Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim as well, at that point it was still a protectorate state. If we cultivated these Himalayan kingdoms as a buffer against India, where China started building roads in Aksai Chin, which was clearly against India's position, India published the new maps, clarifying our position, making it very clear. And this was when parallelly Panchsheel and Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai thing was being promoted. So that shows that there was an element of pragmatism. Then coming to the point on UN, Abhishek sir was trying to say that Nehru was hopeful and he was just putting his blind faith in it. I don't think so. I would like to disagree with that. See, the world order after Second World War had changed. And there was an understanding that we can't go down the same path where we will head towards a third conflict. And don't forget the entry of nuclear weapons as well. So it was very crucial to put faith in a system. Faith, hope was necessary at that point. And UN was an institution which inspired hope at that point in 1945. So Nehru was not entirely wrong when we took the Kashmir issue to the UN. And also don't forget, it made pragmatic sense. We couldn't have dragged the war in Kashmir, because that was not the only problem we were dealing with. Naga insurgency had broken out. There were massive economic problems, abject poverty. We couldn't even put food on the plates of our people.
Sir, but at the same point of time, when you say they created buffer state, etc., you cannot also discount that we ignored defense at that point of time. In a book, Himalayan Blunder, which is written by Brigadier John B. Dalvi, he clearly states that we did not have even rifles. Yes. The right ammunition was not given to us. We were simply dropped to defend a border where on the other side, all of the ammunitions were available to them.
That is specific to the context with China, the Indo-China war.
Yes.
And I'll come to that. I agree that there were mistakes made by Nehru post 1954, 1955. For example, the forward policy, where he was blinded by the advice of Menon, the then Defense Minister, and Nehru wasn't even considering the opinion of the strategic establishment. The facts were very clear. We were outnumbered. I think the ratio was 1:3. Yes. For every one Indian soldier we could mobilize, China was bringing in 3 soldiers on the other side. These ground realities were not considered. Yes, it was an aberration, it was a mistake. But can we character assassinate Nehru just for some of the mistakes?
Sir, this is where I'll just, because you countered to what I said. Isn't the point which you said about him having Panchil at the same point of time also republishing the maps, what I'm trying to argue? That if this is his idealism coming in the way. He is at one point of time talking with China saying that we have no issues, we will protect our territorial integrity. At the same point of time, he's republishing the maps. Why could not have he taken a more, you can say, stronger stance saying that, yes, this is the map. He had a 4-hour conversation with Mao, in which they discussed how British destroyed both of us and how Western imperialism is bad. Why could not he have brought up a basic issue where Excitin and NEFA at that point of time was problematic? And more than that, if you're talking about space technology being so important, the reason why today India has such a big problem in being recognized as a nuclear power, NPT or NSG, is because he said, okay, I understand that there was a larger movement for disarmament. Knowing that we have a problem with Pakistan and we trusted China, but okay, pragmatically we know that we can have an issue with China also. Why did he not just straight away went for disarmament? This is where he had a certain image that I am...
Disarmament where?
He did not allow the nuclear program in India to go forward. Though he took peace. India had the option with no NPT to, at that given point of time, develop nuclear technology for multiple purposes also.
Much later.
I mean, 67, I totally get that.
Nehru had his reservations with regard to India going nuclear, which was valid in that context in 1950s, in early 1950s. In a Cold War divided world, India pursuing nuclear weapons at that point would have been problematic as well from both the sides, from the Soviet bloc and as well as from the American bloc. But later it was Nehru who worked with Homi Bhabha, with Vikram
That I
Sarabhai,
understand.
and initiated the nuclear and space program.
So, which means that Pandit Nehru was realistic at the same time. If he was not realistic, he would have given up on Kashmir. He was emotionally attached to Kashmir because his roots were in Kashmir. He did not want Kashmir to be handed over to Pakistan, and that is where he thought that the best way is to reach out to the United Nations because the body has just been created. So he could not have anticipated that it will fall in the lap of United States, who was a friend of Pakistan, and that Pakistan's bidding would be done by United States.
That is where this is where the problem lies. He understood world politics quite well. Pakistan very quickly became the part of the Western Bloc, and the way the US, UK, and even the basic Western order was making noises, whatever statements were coming, he knew that he was going into a UN which is pro-US and therefore pro-Pakistan at that given point of time.
So can we say that Pakistan joining CENTO at that time, it has now become a state which is under the grip of United States? But since India charted out an independent foreign policy in the form of non-aligned movement, we are not under the dictates of any foreign power. That speaks volumes about the legacy of Pandit Nehru.
That I agree, that NAM was needed. NAM was needed. However, at the same point of time, he is also trying to cultivate good relationships with the US. Once it gets cultivated, then he starts to ask the USSR to say to China that please solve a border dispute. There's a proper correspondence between Gorbachev and Nehru.
Gorbachev comes in 90s.
Khrushchev. So there is a proper correspondence between Khrushchev and Nehru that please ask China Mao to solve this dispute. And the USSR very adamantly said that we can't enter this concept.
But the relationship between China and USSR were frosty.
That is the 1970s. We are talking about the 1950s. But before the taunt, we are not in that moment when the Chinese start to pivot towards the Americans. We are still in the moment of 50s, 60s. This is where the point is that Nehru understood the politics quite well, but he was not able to articulate it in a diplomatic manner.
Okay, let's come back to foreign policy for a moment. whether it is misconception or a reality, is it true that India was offered a UNSC membership, but we gifted it to China? Is it true?
This is one of the biggest myths which has been circulated about Nehru. A lot of it is largely on social media. Now, if you look at the UN, it is established through the UN Charter, right? What does the UN Charter say? There are 5 permanent members. And these 5 permanent members are chosen from different geographical regions. So there's some sort of a quota system. The 5 seats were already filled in 1945, the P5, as we know. The seat for China was held by the Republic of China before the Chinese Civil War. So post 1949, when the Maoist revolution won and defeated ROC, the point of contest over there was, should that seat for China, should it be given to PRC or not? This dragged, the decision whether PRC should take that seat, it dragged until 1971, till relations were normalized between US and the PRC. Now you tell me, how is it possible to replace China with India at that point without amending the UN Charter? And to amend the UN Charter, you need the consensus of all the P5 countries. Let's say US, as the myth says, that US had offered a UNSC seat to India, and this was largely based on a letter written by then Indian Ambassador Vijayalakshmi Pandit, the sister of Nehru, saying that there has been a proposition from the American side. Yeah, exactly. So this can't be seen as a formal or even an informal offer. There is a difference between an offer being made and a feeler being sent.
And it can't come from United States as an individual country.
Exactly. That is point number 1. Second, in fact, Nehru spoke about this in the parliament as well. I think mid-1950s, there's a question on this raised by the opposition that were we offered a seat. Nehru categorically denied that we didn't get any formal or informal request. And again, how do we verify this? Now, if you look at the letter that Vijayalakshmi Pandit had written, this was a feeler given by the then US Secretary of State. The feeler was, we are considering to remove China and give the seat to India. Now, let's see whether this is possible to do. As I said, to remove China as a permanent member and then bring in India, it would require
Amendment to big
amendment of the Charter, which Soviet Union would have never supported. So there is no point even in considering that offer, whatever feeler which came from the US. And also, let's say, hypothetically, let's say we accepted the feeler and we took forward the discussion with the US. How would Soviet Union react to that? India was very clear that we should champion a third pole. We should not lead the world towards divisions again. And even considering that proposal from the US, whatever the informal feeler came in, would have affected our ties with USSR. It would have alienated India-USSR relations as well. The second myth, which is...
Or you would have been considered to be close to the US bloc.
US bloc, exactly. The second myth surrounding this is a proposal made by USSR in 1955, where it is said that the then Soviet leader made a formal offer to Nehru. Again, if you dissect this, if you look at the actual events that took place, the Soviet Union was also just testing out the waters with India. The Soviet proposal was, since PRC is not being given the seat for China, let's bring in a 6th member. Just as an idea, it was being floated by the Soviet leader with Nehru, when Nehru said, China deserves this position. China deserves to hold this position for Asia, and it wouldn't be right to bring in another country at that point from Asia again. And again, you need to look at the larger picture here as
Because clearly Africa was not represented
not
at all.
represented. South America was never represented. And also, if let's say India had gone ahead with the feeler and taken forward these discussions, China would have been hostile to India. Especially if you look at the US feeler, which was to remove China and bring in India as the 5th member. That would have been a hostile move as well, geopolitically. China would have been more aggressive against us. The Soviet feeler which was given was just a test, it was just a bait to see whether India will swing towards the Western bloc or towards the communist bloc. I think it was necessary for us to chart out this path and ensure that China gets its rightful seat. It was China's rightful seat at that point. The only question was, should it be with ROC or PRC?
Chiang Kai-shek
So
or
I don't
Mao.
think India ever had that formal chance to even be considered as a permanent member.
What is your take on Pandit Nehru's legacy when it comes to establishing dams, which you spoke of in your initial remarks, and laying down democratic institutions in India? For example, look at our neighboring countries. India was partitioned into India and Pakistan. So culturally, we are same people. But from the same set of people, we see Pakistan degenerated into a dictatorship. We say in India, state has the army. In Pakistan, army has the state. How far would you agree that it was the contribution of Pandit Nehru for laying down the democratic ethos in India? when it comes to institutions such as Election Commission of India, CAG, and others?
So the contribution was immense. And there I would also like to drive from one of the articles made by Shad sir, that many countries at that point of time had similar problems and they took a different path. I would argue that no other country had the same kind of problems that we had in the subcontinent when it came to diversity, when it came to the fractious nature of the state in itself, when it came to the tendency of separatism which was rising. And Nehru did a lot to ensure that democratic ideals, not only the democratic process, we have to understand, you can instill democratic process. Pakistan did that, but it may not be followed 10 years down the line. Nehru did his best to instill that democratic ideals. Setting up of institutions was definitely one of the significant milestones, but at the same time ensuring that these institutions remain independent. Setting the example for that these institutions can function and thereby create a vibrant democracy. That is the fruit that all of us are basically having the kind of benefit today. When you talk about DAOs, today we all talk about infrastructure, the role of infrastructure. We have seen countries like the US, countries like China grow on the back of infrastructure growth. India at that point of time did not have many resources. Much resources were not available. At that point of time, to have the foresight that these large infrastructure projects, mega infrastructure projects, can be the drivers of change for the country. After all, when we talk about agricultural prosperity, which eventually followed Nehru's time in the 70s and the 80s, which Punjab benefited from, Haryana benefited from, for a long period of time, these were the highest revenue generating states of the country. Where could they generate that amount of revenue? Based upon agriculture. How? Based upon irrigation. Because pre-independence, this portion of Punjab was not something which was very sought after.
So it was not only with regards to high yield variety of seeds that we imported.
Yes.
It was also because of the irrigation facilities which were developed during Pandit Nehru's time.
And came on later on. For example, the Bhakra Nagar, the project which was developed. Now, that water was utilized and the entire irrigational system which came in the decade following Pandit Nehru's tenure, that could be possible because someone had thought about creating a large dam.
So when you talk about, let's say, the infrastructure projects in terms of irrigation, don't you think one of the biggest problems that India faced was distribution of land, which is primary requirement of agriculture sector? So in that case, don't you think along with irrigation, the government should also have focused on land reforms, where we actually failed? We announced reforms, but we were not able to implement. And don't you think that is the reason why there is so much of income inequality within the farmers as such?
So don't you think, sir, land under the distribution of powers comes under state list?
Yes.
So this is where central government has a limited role.
Yes. At the same point of time, I'll come to you, sir. At the same point of time, we must also remember that same political party had formed the government almost in all the states in India. So if leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru, if he had forced the states or asked the states to consider this.
That speaks about the democratic credentials of this man. Although there was a same political party in power at the center as well as states, but that was the beauty of Indian federalism in the form of one-party federalism, where these states, which were governed by Congress party, but they had independent existence. They were not dependent upon the central leader. So there was no such thing as the party high command, which we see today. Across political parties, that was not present at that point.
But sir, that particular argument is overset by another argument that most of the zamindars belong to the same political party. They were able to reap majority of the benefits from agriculture sector. You have created a system where very few people have got majority of the benefit and they belong to a particular political party. It simply shows that he was not powerful enough, or let's say he did not have the confidence to basically ask the states to carry out these reforms in an effective manner.
If he did not have this confidence, then what was the trigger of the first Constitutional Amendment Act 1951? Land Reforms Act was passed, Zamindari Abolition Act was passed. It was the Patna High Court which declared this law as unconstitutional. What Pandit Nehru did, got the parliament together, amended the constitution, added Article 31 capital A, 31 capital B, 9 schedule, and gave immunity to these land-related laws from judicial review. That was the powerful nature of Pandit Nehru. That's what he did.
So land reform was initiated during his time.
Yes.
And when you were saying that
Telangana is the beautiful example of a successful land reforms which happened in independent India, apart from Jammu and Kashmir.
and those states where land reform could actually be implemented, those states are yielding the benefits and have yielded the benefits for a long period of time. And when you are saying irrigation was something that he paid attention to, not a lot of attention was paid to the land reform, you have to understand that India, modern independent India, inherited the zamindari system. And the various power centers within his party, within the Commerce Party, as you yourself said, they were zamindars. So to take a step against the zamindari system, that speaks volumes about Nehru's vision. At the same time, we have to understand that a lot of migrants had come from Pakistan. And they did not have any land. They had left all the property behind. And the region that they were given, the allocation was happening, that was a dry land. They were leaving behind the region where they had canal irrigation and everything was available. And they were being allocated a land which was not preferred pre-independence. That is what I said, that this was not an agricultural land which was preferred by anyone. They were given that land. So wasn't that the prime purpose of the leader of a very fragile state at that point of time? To provide irrigation so that the displaced people, the people who have suffered immensely, they have some avenue to earn. And the fruits of it, Punjab did usher in a new revolution. You had, for example, the rural electrification. The rural electrification which was stressed upon at the time of Pandit Nehru, that was something which yielded benefits in the states of Punjab. That meant that irrigated water would be supplied. That meant, and at that point of time, yes, there is a criticism that canals were concentrated in the region around Delhi, but we always forget that we had very, very limited resources. Ideal world would have been what? Our defense should have been perfect. Our agricultural policies should have been perfect. Everything could have been perfect. But we had very scarce resources. And in that point of time, to think about irrigation, I think that is a very perfect.
I would basically counter this argument by saying that it's not that he did not request, let's say, expert advice. I'll quote the expert advice that was given by Arthur Lewis. I'll quote the example of Milton Friedman. All of them argued that whatever policies that you are implementing, these are not in the right direction. These are not pragmatic in nature. For example, you have steel, you have a lot of resources, you have a lot of surplus labor. Why not invest in, let's say, steel production? That was one of the recommendations that was given by Arthur Lewis. It was rejected. And as a result of that, later on, Chinese industries, Japanese industries, Korean industries basically grew in terms of steel production.
But heavy industries were established in India?
Yes, sir. Heavy industries were established, but the argument of experts was it was driven by government-owned industries.
Yes.
We should not have taken this particular policy for a longer duration. That was same recommendation by even Dr. B.R. Ambedkar as well. Some role should be played by the government industries, no doubt, because most of the population falls in the poverty. But at the same point of time, you cannot deny the fact that private sector is also important. But what the policies were implemented, Industrial Policy of 1948, IDRA of 1951, Industrial Policy of 1956, all these policies were implemented to shrink the private sector and give more role to the government. As a result of this, what happened? Licensing regime cropped up. Corruption cropped up. Most of these industries later on made losses. Government of India had to use the taxpayers' money to pay for that.
Sir, here I would say that yes, some of their economic policies, they can be critiqued later. But you have to understand, what was his point of view at that point of time? India needed employment. And he was convinced, and rightfully so, the employment generation capability of a state-owned firm can be much more as compared to a private-owned firm, because privately owned firm will always take a look into profit. And here, when you are citing some of the economic policies, I would go into insight into the fact that a newly independent India with various different states with their own individual interests. Now the states at that point of time were very keen on the fact that if I have the mineral resource, I should get a substantial amount of royalty for that. That would have limited industrialization in the states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha itself. The fact that the minerals from that region at the same rate could be utilized by the state, like suppose Gujarat, by like suppose Tamil Nadu, by any other state. That also is the economic foresight of Pandit Nehru.
Which has now been overturned by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has given
But sir, that
Now you have the facility to do that. Now you have the leeway to do that.
Sir,
But at that point of time, we did not.
the counter argument to that policy will be when you want to invest in all of it, you should have savings. Did we have sufficient savings at that point of time? When you know that you do not have sufficient savings, why not open up the market?
But Shamsar,
Yes, there are concerns. Later on, in 1991, what did we do? We did the same thing. Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was the finance minister, basically argued against the policy of Jawaharlal Nehru.
But Shamsar, don't you think as a newly independent country, we should be focused more on the social goals than just the economic basis of the policy? Because public sector companies would always focus on the social aspect as well, which private industries would have never done. And also private capital at that point in 50s, we're talking prior to, let's say, 1960s, right? So private capital wasn't sufficient to drive investments and growth.
So these things will work out when you have the correct system in the place. When you basically introduce a licensing regime and tell the private sector, I will control what you produce. I will control how much price at which you will sell. That basically led to a lot of corruption in the system.
Was it also because of the insecurities that the then government felt because of the East India Company or the legacy of that?
One is East India Company, and the second one is it was after Second World War, and also we looked at the Great American Depression. We felt that capitalism will not work out very well in India. And when America was basically facing the depression, Soviet Union was performing well, and that followed the model of socialism.
So, which means Pandit Nehru was following the legacy of a system, of a model which worked well then.
Yes,
But you should not be.
but the situation
economic
of India was different compared to situation in Soviet Union. We do not have the same kind of a political system. We do not have the same kind of resources that they have. So I would argue that his policies at that point of time were unrealistic in nature.
he wanted to bring the best of all the world, but into Indian system. That is where when you say that, for example, anything, for example, that why didn't he take a very tough stance on China? He had, on one hand, border deployment, on the other hand, punchy. That is what a leader is. You hope for the best, you prepare for the worst. That is where the foresight of the leader comes in. Now, when you talk about the economic foresight of Pandit Nehru, now you have to understand that we chose to be a mixed economy because the capitalist world was not performing well. And you have to understand, great minds of that point of time, for example, be it even Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein had famously quoted that Soviet system is going to work in terms of development of human capital in the long run, whereas the American capitalist system is going to fail in the long run. So if everyone around the world, and there are examples around you which tell you that capitalist system is leading to the deprivation of the masses. After all, Nehru was a great believer in Gandhian ideology, and Mahatma Gandhi always believed that a reason for economic inequality, poverty, has been concentration of capital and industrialization. He wanted Gram Swaraj, that individual production centers should be there. That is the ideal that Nehru followed, yes.
But I would basically disagree with this particular argument, sir.
Before you make this point, I'll just clarify one point. The USSR you're talking about is not the USSR as a socialist nation. Under Stalin, in no way they were following socialism. So this presumption that capitalism was in a way not performing well during the post-Second World War period is again a flawed understanding. It was very clear with Truman Doctrine and with the idea which was being pushed to the Marshall Plan and what we could see in West Berlin and West Germany, that capitalism was eventually going to win as it is, and Leninistic ideals of planned economy was then released as a
Post-May, which became much more clearer in the 70s and 80s.
Because what is the criticism of Pandit Nehru, or for that matter, the economic philosophy of the government of India? Maybe we could have embraced capitalism ahead
Much
of
sooner.
when we did.
That's the point.
Which is where China was at an advantage.
I don't think so. I think they say very vulnerable. For example, India at that point of time was not prepared.
No, we are not talking about 1950s or 60s. We're talking about 70s. So
that is one of the criticisms. When we have
which cannot be the criticism of the legacy of Pandit Nehru. Maybe his policies were fine at that point in time, but after that, his successors would have embraced capitalism much ahead.
But he had
but I would argue that
Even today, our system is not completely open to the rest of the world. We don't allow complete capital convertibility in our country.
Yes.
To prevent us from external shocks, that is one of the factors which have prevented the outspill of the 2008 financial crisis into India or 1997 economic crisis of Asia into India. So imagine what could have been the condition if Nehru had opened up the economy like we envisage it to be.
Sir, coming to that point, but let me ask you, Abhishek sir. Pandit Nehru was a prime minister, the longest serving prime minister. It was argued that at that point in time, if even a lamp post was set up as a candidate, but the ticket was given by the Congress party, that lamp post would have won.
Yes, sir.
Right. It would have been easier for Pandit Nehru to compromise the institutions, to capture political power, to erode the democratic edifice of India. Yet he did not do that.
Sir, but that is where Nehru does not represent that. Our criticism of Nehru is not that he had the chance to capture power. Nehru was a true democrat, true socialist. Nehruvian socialism, as captured by the Constitution 39 BNC, is the basis of how we operate as a nation and the mixed economy aspect. So our criticism is not that the Congress had too much power. The criticism is that he has multiple opportunities to pivot. And he was extremely conscious of what was happening, be it economic policy, be it foreign policy. And this argument which is coming through is that India was fragile. India had a colonial, I could have said that argument easily, that because we came from a colonial past, we had challenges. But you cannot justify every action, maybe 20, 30 years down the line, saying that no, we were in that state. He was the architect, as they said, of modern India. He had multiple opportunities and enough expertise and understanding. And a point which you said about that land reforms failed, he had that because cooperative federalism or federalism was the reason why land reforms failed, is not a good argument. If he had the intention to remove zamindari permanent and Raitwari settlements and thereafter also introduce, which is removing the zamindari regime after that, if he had the intention of producing dams in areas which would also be quite problematic when it comes to the tribes. The tribal policy of Nehru, the way he managed and basically isolated the tribes itself, and the amount of money which was being spent into dams. If he has that know-how and understanding, he also had the know-how and understanding that land reforms were needed. But because his own party had a very big lobby within this, there was a political will. And let's be very honest, if Nehru, Patel, the party, the INC, if it wanted land reforms, it would have got land reforms. But the idea was there was no political will. So the criticism which both of us are making for the past 45 minutes is Nehru was not naive. He had pragmatism. So why not show it in the political, foreign and economic? Why that idealism? Nehruvian socialism made sense in 50s, made sense in 60s. Did not make sense.
So let me give you two examples of Nehru being pragmatic. Point number one, as a newly independent country with limited resources, planned model of development worked well for India, what we learned from the Soviet Union. That allowed us to prioritize our limited resources, ensure that we go for a planned model of development. Again, you are looking at this in retrospect. Now it's easy to say that this should have been that.
Hindsight 2020, yeah.
Sir, it's not retrospect per se. For example, let's say when you talk about investment policies, etc., planning commission was made. Where was the representation of the states in the planning commission? You have a institution, you control it. It's not a constitutional body, by the way. It was set up through an executive order. So you knew that there is a body which will represent the whole of India, make a plan for whole of India. And you do not give space for the states who are the parties to implement the plan. So don't you think that's a faulty, let's say, policy making?
If Planning Commission did not have the representation from the states, but there was National Development Council,
Yes.
which was a federal body,
Yes.
which had the Prime Minister and all the states. And basically the 5-year plans which were approved by the Planning Commission would need to be approved by the India CSE.
Yes, but the problem here is you are including the states after the fact that the plan is made. You're basically asking the states to.
Previous argument was Nehru should have been very adamant in forcing the states
Yes.
to implement land reforms.
Yes.
And now when he is forthright into planning
Yes.
the 5-year plan way,
Yeah.
and you're opposing him for this.
My
You can't make the
argument,
both ways.
my argument is, if you want to implement all of this, including states, why not include the states at the planning stage rather than approving stage? That is my contention. And mind you, again, I'm repeating myself. It is not a constitutional body. You don't have to move a constitutional amendment. You could simply, through executive resolution, include the states. For example, today in Niti Aayog, the states are included. So my argument.
Niti Aayog is only a
Yes.
think tank.
Yes.
But it's not having the same role as the planning
So
commission.
I'm saying it is also a body which has been set up through executive resolution. That was also a body which was set up through executive resolution.
So your problem is with one size fits all formula,
Yes.
which was used by planning.
Yes. The
Sir, I would we were talking about agriculture. I would write the point of agriculture. We know that India is a very diverse country when it comes to physiography, when it comes to the climatic conditions. It was during the tenure of Pandit Nehru when, upon his nudge, the Planning Commission started thinking about agroclimatic zones, and the country was divided into 15 different agroclimatic zones so that each of them could follow different kind of agricultural practice. So that is something which, again, yielded fruits in the coming years.
So if we're giving a sense as
Yeah.
if Nehru did nothing wrong.
So basically, if you are
a sense as if he did nothing right. Reality is somewhere in between.
I'll ask you this question. Yes, you tell us the context for the first Constitution Amendment. And I think we'll understand why we are saying that when it came to be pragmatic, he was pick and choosing.
So First Amendment in the sense, how do you have 31B?
No, the concept of public order being added to take away the fundamental rights.
Now, let's look at it this way. Constitution has given you fundamental rights, but these fundamental rights are not absolute.
True.
Reasonable restrictions have to be imposed, and these reasonable restrictions are mentioned in the Constitution itself. But unlike United States, where reasonable restrictions evolve through the judiciary, through judicial interpretations, our Constitution has given the power to the Parliament that you use Article 368 to add more reasonable restrictions. So if during Pandit Nehru's time, Parliament got together, added public order as a reasonable restriction on Article 19(1)(a), Parliament is just doing its job as mandated by the Constitution. Now, whether that was right or wrong, let me ask you this question. Imagine you are in a multiplex and you're watching a movie, eating popcorn, whether caramelized or salted, or whatever. And suddenly you cry, fire, fire, fire. There is no fire. What will happen? There will be stampede.
True.
People will rush through the exit, and then the police will come and tell you that you are under arrest. I would say, why? Because you have caused stampede. You have disturbed public order. I can't claim I have the freedom of speech and expression to say whatever I have to say. There has to be reasonable restriction, and public order is that reasonable restriction. If public order was not a ground, then you could have seen magazines, newspapers publishing inflammatory articles, inciting people to violence. Public order is the responsibility of the government to safeguard. And for that, if there is a need to impose restrictions on your freedom of speech and expression, I think that was warranted.
But if Nehru had the understanding of doing this, then why was he opposing Patel in the first 2 years for police reforms? When Patel said that we need a better police based on more executive powers. So this is where that, how do I say it? It's a dichotomy, or you can say a certain paradoxical understanding where he wants to be pragmatic. He's pragmatic.
He was afraid of politicization of the police.
Exactly. Don't forget the police we inherited was a colonial police.
That I understand.
Any reforms that
Was against Indian civil services. He wanted Indian civil services to be discarded. And thanks to Patel, that is why he is known as the father of all India services.
Yes.
He ensured that constitutional status is given to IAS and IPS, which speaks volumes about the pragmatic nature of Pandit Nehru. He did not oppose it.
So then,
But at the same point of time, sir, he was instrumental in basically what happened in Kerala with the government. So, don't you think that is undemocratic character of Pandit Nehru?
Yes, and that is a blot on the legacy of Pandit Nehru. That is why wherever you will speak about Pandit Nehru, you will hear this instance of the misuse of Article 356 while dismissing the Tribunalist government in Kerala. but you also need to understand the global picture at that time. You were talking about Russia not being socialist.
Yeah.
In fact, there is no communist state anywhere in the world.
True.
And whenever a socialist party has come to power, it has never come to power through democratic means. It has always come to power through revolution or through violent means or through overthrow of democratically elected government. The only place where a communist or a socialist government came to power through democratically elected means was Kerala. And this is where there are numerous reports that CIA played a very important role in building that narrative that we need to dismiss, because the entire foreign policy of United States was focused on how do we prevent these newly independent Asian and African countries from embracing socialism. We want them in the lap of capitalism. So this is where United States...
One more overreach has recently been pointed out with the declassification of the Bose files in the National Archives. As it turns out, between 1948 and 68, there was proper state surveillance on the family of Subhash Chandra Bose, with every letter being opened, photocopied and documented between the wife of Bose and his family members in Bengal. And that was sanctioned by the same Nehru. He knew that he was, in a way, it is an executive overreach. What is the point of having surveillance on a towering leader who is not no more?
How do you know he was no more at that time?
That Gumnami Baba argument, and the fact of the matter is that is also one of the biggest arguments. I will not go into conspiracy theory vis-a-vis how the Nehruvian government in a way kept the secrets related to Bose under the carpet, and there was a lot of, you can say, sanitization of the image. But just to add to the Kerala point, this is where
I think now is the right time to declassify all the files related to...
So the problem with that is the Germany connection. So whatever, it's for the Russian connection. He was going to Russia, that Russia joined the war. He was going to Russia. He thought that USSR is going to help us against the British. They came on
after meeting Hitler?
No, it's just that once he saw Stalin going with the Operation Barbarossa, he then shifted to going to Germany. Hitler told that Japanese have developed an INA, go there. And there's a very interesting story that Subhash Chandra Bose had to hop between two submarines. From a German submarine to a Japanese submarine. That is the... but the point is that this is where we all are in agreement also that there are certain points of Nehru where he may have also undercut his own principle and his own understanding and his own image to do things. So if he was pragmatic enough to do that in that moment, then why cultivate a certain type of ideology?
How would you look at Pandit Nehru as a writer? You're a writer yourself. You're a historian.
Sure.
And Pandit Nehru was also a historian that way. So his books, we can call him a philosopher king. How would you rate him as a writer? In fact, I remember something that I was reading many years ago. In 1937, when he became the president of the Indian National Congress for the third time, there was an individual named Chanakya who wrote an article in a magazine criticizing Pandit Nehru, calling him with dictatorial tendencies, that we do not need another Caesar, the reference to Julius Caesar. And it was later argued that that was written by Pandit Nehru himself.
Modern Review was the Bengali magazine.
Right.
Which was written, yeah.
So how would you rate... You can't see somebody of his stature doing it now, writing a column, critiquing himself.
So this is where Nehru is privileged also. Let's be very honest, he comes from a very, very good background. Motilal Nehru, himself a moderate, towering leader. Equally well-written documents are known from Dr. Ambedkar. But we are not calling him philosopher king. The idea is...
Because he was not the prime minister.
He was not the prime minister. See, calling him the philosopher king itself is problematic. Pandit Nehru...
Oh, there can't be a king in the cause.
So he wrote quite extensively. Because he got influenced by the Russian Revolution, the socialist ideologies, he tried to articulate that also. He went against his own instinct to go against Gandhi when it came to dominion status and complete independence. I would say that, yes, we don't have statesmen like him who can articulate themselves also. Nobody, ghostwriters not writing the Bal things. So the idea is that Nehru himself was able to articulate.
And his speech?
Yes. Just with this. That is why Gandhi chose him as Though the AICC wanted Patel to be the Prime Minister, or at least the leader who goes into the interim government, they presume that he will become the Prime Minister. Gandhi said that I need the charisma of Nehru as of right now to go into negotiations with Mountbatten, go into negotiations with the US.
But in 1927, Pandit Nehru and Gandhiji, they had fierce disagreements with
This is where Bose Nehru were, that is where we tend to see Bose and Nehru in verses also, but Bose and Nehru were both in agreement. This is where he actually questioned his father.
My question is, how did Gandhiji chose Pandit Nehru as a successor? Because I told this to that not Rajaji, but Pandit Nehru is my successor.
38, 39 is a turning point. This is where
Subhash Chandra Bose is
Gandhi realizes that Subhash Chandra Bose is too radical for the national movement. So Nehru at that given point of time, that is why I tell you that Nehru is extremely pragmatic. This is where he takes a middle path. He says no unconditional support, but no armed revolution. We will have concessions, then only be 40 and 40.
But he also sided with Gandhiji when Gandhiji supported after the Second World War that we should have an unconditional support for the British.
So, sir, that is where Nehru did not say that. In Ramgarh session, in the Varda resolution, it was straightforward. You had the Congress socialists saying unconditional, we should go for a CDM, civil disobedience movement at that point. Gandhi said unconditional vote, I support Churchill over Hitler, both being monsters in that regard. But Nehru said, we want concessions, then we will enter the war cabinet. That is where the coziness of Jinnah and Lithgow also went against India in that regard. But Nehru, when it came to pivoting, he was the master of pivoting. He knew where to sit when it came to where the political power will lie. I will not say that he is opportunistic. It is that Nehru knew what was needed at that given point of time.
And he was also hilarious. If you read his biography or the anecdotes of people who knew him, it was argued that he was in Trinity College first, then went to Cambridge. And Motilal Nehru, his father, is writing a letter to him that I think you are spending too much. I need your expenses. And he replies to his father that either you should trust me or you should not trust me. If you trust me, then no account is required. If you don't trust me, then the account that I'm sharing with you should not be trusted. In another instance, Firag Gorakhpuri, I think he was the poet, he was called by Motilal Nehru that you work with me. And then Firag Gorakhpuri is now seeking an advice from his friend that whether I should work with Motilal Nehru or not. And his friend is telling him that even if you are dying from hunger, you should not work for this man because of his temperament. And who this friend was? Pandit Nehru. So Pandit Nehru is advising his friend not to work with his father.
Sir, this is where he asked his father that when did we decide that we want dominion status? When Nehru report came, he was outraged. So he was that.
This Nehru report, you see, you mean Motilal Nehru?
Motilal report in 1928. That is when we got the challenge for being correct. The idea is, sir, that Nehru is, we will never have another Nehru, Patel or Bose. That is where we, I think, cannot deny his legacy. Whatever points, negative points we said, I would still say that Nehru was Nehru. But he must have had, and he did had, a lot of opportunities where he could have pivoted. If he had understood his mistakes, which he was introspective, if he has the opportunity and if he has the understanding to say that don't join my father, he was introspective. He was very well informed. He understood politics also quite well. He may have dragged things which were against India or made our path quite problematic.
But don't call him anti-national.
No, he's not anti-national. He made Patel's path of integration very difficult. He was extremely against Junagadh's, you can say, intervention of India. He delayed intervention into the Hyderabad sector. Patel you can say he had to take oxygen because he said that you are a communalistic, you are not able to understand what is happening in the princely states. Heavy-handedness and high-handedness during that moment have complicated our path. So Nehru is needed, but maybe we had a certain...
But we can always have a critical analysis of his legacy.
It is an anachronistic proposition to assess him today. We had the privilege of saying what we are saying because of him only. So it is anachronistic that we are trying to do that, but yeah.
Towards the end, one final thoughts from all of us, but I cannot stop without asking you about what's happening on social media, the references to the personal life of Pandit Nehru, his involvement with Lady Mountbatten. How do you look at it?
Should one's personal life matter in political space or public space? I don't think so.
No.
Again, this is largely based on rumors, conspiracies. Or let's say, even if
seal of truth to it. But we should not comment on the personal life of an individual.
that is exact character assassination, literally.
Highly unfair.
And how would you respond to this criticism that he awarded himself Bharat Ratna?
But the reality of the matter is something else. It was he who was blindsided at that point of time when the president told him that you will have to accept the Bharat Ratna. And he was not an individual who would present himself with awards. He was a very popular mass leader at that point of time. He did not need those validations.
So you're saying that awarding Bharat Ratna was not something that he awarded himself. It was something that he was forced to accept by the president. In fact, he was coming from a foreign trip where it was announced to him that we have decided to confer Bharat Ratna.
And we were at the banquet. So at that point of time, he could not do anything.
At the same point of time, sir, I have a question. He is also regarded as one of the people who promoted dynastic politics. To what extent is this true?
That you should ask these gentlemen.
If that were to be true, the path for Indira Gandhi's prime ministership would have been much easier. But Indira Gandhi had to struggle to establish herself.
Gulzari Lal Nanda was acting prime minister twice. After the death of Nehru, it could have been Indira Gandhi as the prime minister. But we went with first Gulzari Lal Nanda, then Lal Bahadur Shastri. It is only after Lal Bahadur Shastri died under mysterious circumstances at Tashkent. There we had Gulzari Lal Nanda again. And then it was the party which decided to have Indira Gandhi. In fact, there were some who called Indira Gandhi Gungi Gudiya, who actually grew to be Durga in 1971. So was Nehru who established dynastic politics in India? Maybe not true. But one final thoughts from all of us, starting with Abhishek sir. Now you should say something where you can praise Pandit Nehru, and I will ask the other party to also list down some of the criticisms.
So, as a concluding remark, I think there will be no Nehru again. Jawaharlal Nehru was a towering figure of the national movement, and I think the challenges which they talked about, which we faced in 1947-48, the duo of Patel and Nehru was actually what India needed, and maybe it is his charisma and his pragmatism, which is somehow Nehru was able to follow his idealism because Patel was pragmatic. So I say this in class, I say it again. It is very easy for us to say that he should have done this and that, but in that context, what he did was extremely important, and maybe we have foresight. We knew that the God that failed, socialism failed, and the USSR, we should have not pivoted towards that. So in a point of praise, any criticism and demonization of Nehru is uncalled for. For the purpose of political motive, we should not, in a way, demonize or eulogize certain personalities.
So we can always do an honest criticism of a political leader, which you have been doing throughout this program, without casting aspersions on the motives of an individual.
That is where we'll be harsh, but we don't have a political agenda. History is used only to misuse it.
Shamsad.
His contribution in terms of getting independence as well as framing the Constitution of India, the benefits of which all of us are enjoying today. I really appreciate him for that contribution.
Chetan sir, you spoke about the legacy of Pandit Nehru's foreign policy, but he was not very critical of the USSR's invasion of Hungary. Would that be a fair criticism of Pandit Nehru?
No, not at all. See, if you look at the context.
Just like I asked them to praise, it is a criticize. They need to have a critical analysis, and
I will come to the critical points as well. I did point out one, which was 1962. Nehru was clearly at fault. The blunders committed did lead to the 62 war, which was avoidable. But yeah, coming back to your question on Hungary. Just before what happened in Hungary, the Suez crisis had taken place, right? And where Britain, France, Israel had attacked Egypt. So at that point, Nehru was very proactive to criticize the Western intervention, labeled it as imperialist expansionism again. He even urged US to intervene as well. But the same kind of enthusiasm was not seen when the crisis erupted in Hungary, where it was quite clear that Soviet Union had a role to play. But again, let's look at what records are available. What records tell us, established records tell us, is that when the reports came from Hungary regarding the mass uprising, it was largely a Western narrative, where Western media was influenced by, let's say, American intelligence agencies. So Nehru's call was to wait, let's see what exactly is happening in Hungary. Then second, when things became clear, even then, yes, Nehru didn't criticize Soviet involvement in Hungary. So here we need to think of the other dimensions as well. Soviet Union had given complete support to us on Kashmir. Let's say India had openly criticized Soviet Union. Soviet Union would have definitely withdrawn that support. This is very clear when Soviet ambassador met Nehru during this crisis, subtly indicating that if you don't stand with us, we are back on withdrawal.
This is where he was pragmatic.
That's where, exactly. He was not idealistic, he was very pragmatic there. And he defended this vehemently as well. That yes, we did criticize, but the reason was this, where Soviet Union would have withdrawn the support, and support from a P5 member was critical on Kashmir at that point.
Sure.
Then another important point is when the resolution was brought up at UN, which was pushed by US and the Western powers, criticizing Soviet Union directly for what happened in Hungary. Yeah. The then Indian permanent representative, Krishna Menon again, he abstained from the vote, right? And Nehru defended the decision to abstain as well. Because if you look at how UN voting takes place, it's paragraph by paragraph voting. We abstained from all the paragraphs which were not problematic to show that we are taking a middle path because we were still building up the non-aligned agenda. There was one specific paragraph pushed in by US and UK which called for UN monitored elections in Hungary. Now supporting this resolution, right, would have been highly problematic again with regard to Kashmir. Would UN consider such an election, UN monitored election for Kashmir as well? If we support this there, just to show that we are being neutral, just to oppose Soviet Union, then tomorrow other powers might push for a similar UN monitored election.
Just like what the current government is doing vis-a-vis Russia, Ukraine, making a middle path.
Middle path. So it was a very pragmatic call. It was, trust me, it was not a mistake on that front. But coming to criticism of Nehru, 1962 was definitely a blunder. Not listening to the advice coming from the strategic establishment.
Even if the intentions were pure.
Intention.
But as they say, the path to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah. So a lot of mistakes were made when the ground realities weren't taken into account. India clearly was on the back foot. We didn't have the numbers to get aggressive against China. Every sane advice indicated we should try the path of diplomacy. We should have scaled back. We should have avoided the war.
And even on that front, Parliament was kept in loop. Parliament was being told what is happening between India and China.
While we all agree that Nehru has been the towering personality and architect of modern India, and you ask for a set of criticism. So if I have to criticize him, I would again talk about the diplomacy leading to the war. Yes, during the war, mistakes were made. But what we did right during the 1971 war was take the global order along with us. We had built the global perception that this is something which is happening wrong in the subcontinent. That did not happen prior to 1962.
But despite that, United States would send its 7th Fleet to attack
in the 1970s. Yes. But then the larger population of the world, Mrs. Indira Gandhi at that point of time traveled significantly to very different areas of the world, gave interviews to various different press clubs and media houses to apprise them of the situation of migrants coming into West Bengal and the humanitarian crisis which was unfolding in East Pakistan at that point of time. Something on the similar lines could have been done in the late 1950s when we had the Chinese building or carrying out the construction activities around the Karakoram Pass. That was very, very problematic. And also with regards to Kashmir. Now, when Indian armed forces had initiated the action, the armed forces were not in the favor of immediate ceasefire being called. So there also the feedback loop in the system, that slightly was something which was faltered. So that is the only criticism that I will reserve for him. Otherwise, he was one of the personalities that I don't think India...
Sir, I want to ask a question to Chetan, sir. Point blank, sir. Giving political asylum to Dalai Lama, mistake or the right thing to do in 1959?
Strategically right move and a humanitarian move as well.
But
the crisis in Tibet was the biggest humanitarian crisis at that point. So accommodating the Tibetan refugees and giving asylum to Dalai Lama was the right humanitarian move. That would set the right tone for India as a emerging global leader.
And as a follow-up to that, the current day criticism of Pandit Nehru, do you feel that this criticism would not have been leveled against Pandit Nehru had the descendants of Pandit Nehru not been in politics today?
Descendants as in?
The family, they are also active in politics.
Yes, I think that has a big role to play. Because the dynastic kind of politics which got built up, 70s, 80s and continued in early 2000 as well, I think that has a lot to do with the image tarnishing which has happened as a part of a political...
And despite the fact that during his time, his son-in-law was against his government. He led to the some of the vociferous protests inside the parliament on LIC, on which his finance minister had to resign.
Right. When you look at much of the propaganda which is there regarding dynastic politics from the Gandhi family, right, or the Nehru-Gandhi family, the propaganda goes all the way back to Nehru, when actually Nehru didn't really build up the dynastic.
That is unjustified. That is all political narrative. That is totally politics.
But I do agree with one criticism that Shyam sir was pointing out, that Nehru should have pivoted towards a different form of economic model.
True.
There was a point where the pivot should have happened, which didn't happen.
And he was seeing what was happening in USSR, what he unfolding in front of him. He had a chance to pivot. He pivoted everywhere else. Somehow there
I feel the successive governments after Nehru,
They were at fault.
yes, yeah, they were more at fault because now they had a clear-cut idea of what works in India.
Or they should have a clear-cut idea. They should have had a clear-cut idea.
What would work and what would not work. So at that point of time, to still stick to the socialist path by the successive governments, I would put the blame on them rather than the Nehruvian government.
And maybe some other day I would discuss with you, Abhishek sir, about the allegations or the criticism of how the history books were being written at that point in time. But maybe that demands another debate.
Sir.
As I said at the start of this program, that the idea is not to create a wedge. The idea is to have a critical analysis of the legacy of Pandit Nehru, the good and the bad of it. What is your take after watching this episode on the legacy of Pandit Nehru? Do let us know in the comment section. And thank you so much for staying with us today. All the best.